Network. Here we are at the Go Local Live Center, 90 Way Boston Street, Providence, Rhode Island, the city we love. CoalitionRadio.us, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_Radio. And as always, please follow our apolitical, anti-paw socks, anti-crony capitalist feed at Pawtucket is Home. For I believe the fourth consecutive week, we are privileged and proud to bring someone on the line, and he's a returning coalition visitor from the Goldwater Institute. Now, I've spoken often about their contribution here at the national level in terms of politics, in terms of theory, but also what distinguishes them from so many folks who have lots of great ideas, their willingness to engage, if you will, in the field of battle, otherwise known as the court of law. And no one is more of a Renaissance guy in doing that, is senior attorney of the Goldwater Institute. Of course, Jim Manley joins us live from the greater Phoenix, Arizona area via Skype. Welcome back to the coalition.
Thanks for having me.
Well, now, the last time you were here, we were talking about some successful litigation that you'd had in challenging state, or in this case, county level debt that was used to finance private projects. Something that still resonates very strongly here in Rhode Island. Tonight we're on a completely different level, and talk about timeliness. I can't think of a single week in recent American history where the question of free speech and the role of free speech in a society has been more controversial and more hotly discussed on so many different levels in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, in addition to fighting corporate cronyism, in addition to doing investigative reporting on the all too cozy relationship between municipal courts and the people who would appoint them, in addition to their high-level analysis of healthcare, one of the other projects of the Institute is campus free speech. Jim, why don't you give us a little background on your initiative, particularly how it's impacted in North Carolina, and what you're trying to accomplish, and really, what are the events that led up to this that all of a sudden are so timely this week?
Yeah, so we introduced this model bill at the end of January, and then 2 days later, UC Berkeley was on fire because Milo Yiannopoulos was scheduled to give a talk there. Mm-hmm. So this timeliness issue seems to just come up again and again. The First Amendment issue is not going away.
Right.
We got involved in this because we saw a crisis on campus. The first indication of that was, for us locally, were students who were arrested by the campus police because they were handing out constitutions outside of the designated free speech zone. And so because they weren't in this little postage stamp size area, they were violating the campus speech code by handing out constitutions.
Now, let me jump in for a second. Let's absorb that for a second now.
Sure, it's worth absorbing.
Both of my daughters, one daughter recently graduated from college, and another one is attending college. And I can remember so clearly when my older daughter went for the campus tour at Georgetown University. Now, think about that. Georgetown University, prestigious, internationally renowned university, covering and generating some of the leaders of our foreign policy initiatives here, in the heart, if you will, of the federal belt in D.C. They were bragging about their free speech zone, and I kind of raised my hand in that moment that every teenage daughter truly admires. I asked them, this is the only place I got free speech? So this notion of a free speech zone, this is pervasive amongst campuses nationwide, isn't it?
Yeah, and so what we did in Arizona was just to eliminate this idea of free speech zones, to enact the idea that you proposed in your question, that you should have the First Amendment right to speak anywhere on campus. Mm-hmm. And once we did that, we started talking with some folks that have been working on this issue more deeply and more broadly, and we realized that there was a much bigger problem encompassed in speech codes, in safe spaces, in trigger warnings, in all of these regulations that universities impose that are based on the content and many times the viewpoint of the speech. Mm-hmm. So that's why we came up with this model bill that is really, it's a comprehensive solution, what we hope is a solution to this campus speech crisis that we've seen enacted month after month this year.
So how is, now this law, this has currently been enacted into law in Arizona?
So the more narrow piece banning free speech zones, that has been enacted in Arizona. North Carolina is the first state to run with our model bill that takes a more comprehensive approach and has passed it there. We introduced it in January, as I said, and then 8 states quickly took it up and was considered in 8 state legislatures. Some of those bills are still moving forward. The only one that is completely dead is in Louisiana, where the governor vetoed the bill after it had passed with bipartisan support in the legislature. That just goes to show how powerful the universities are and how much they don't want the legislature working to defend constitutional rights if it means that the university has somebody looking over their shoulder.
Right. Now, so in its initial stage, it directly addressed in Arizona free speech zones. What are some of the other issues that it tackles? And by the way, we'll be posting the PDF of the model legislation on the coalitionradio.us in partnership with the recording of this discussion. And you should see that either on Sunday or Monday. But what are some of the other tangible issues that it tackles in terms of the North Carolina legislation?
So at bottom, what the bill does is it prohibits these sort of content and viewpoint-based regulations that we've seen on college campuses. So the idea that a speaker can be disinvited because of his or her views, the universities are not allowed to do that anymore. The idea that the universities can set up speech codes that are that broadly stifle freedom of expression, outlawed under our model bill. And importantly, we replace all of that with a commitment to free expression. So at freshman orientation, instead of getting an explanation of where the free speech zone is and a discussion of how to comply with the speech code so you don't hurt anyone's feelings, there's a discussion about free expression and how important it is to have a broad range of views and to learn how to engage with those views in a civil way. So it takes, that's sort of the long-term approach is going to freshman orientation and reforming that so it's a commitment to free expression. In the short term, we call for universities to use their existing authority to discipline students in situations like shout-downs or blockades, where students will stop an event from going forward by just screaming at the speaker or by blocking the doors. And in those situations, we've seen every month this year, this academic year, this past year, we've seen a shout down or a blockade. And in only 2 of the instances that I'm aware of has there been any real discipline. And so, you know, the behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated. And what we've seen is that students have realized that if they don't want to hear a viewpoint, instead of engaging with that person, they can simply cancel the event by shouting it down. And we want to put a stop to that immediately so we can reinvigorate this idea that free expression and free exchange is a core value at our universities.
Now, I want to develop on this, and we've got a half hour of your time tonight, so there's a lot we need to cover in a short period of time. But it's interesting because here and you actually cite Brown University President Paxson in your piece. Notoriously, a couple of years ago, the police chief from the city of New York visited Brown University and was the subject of a shout-down. Now, in a much more dangerous, more highly nuanced environment, you've got the challenge between the quote-unquote alt-right and Antifa. In both cases, and I'm going to ignore the left-right considerations, but from an ethical standpoint, I love your opinion on this. In both cases, both organizations are citing the overwhelming harm that has been created by the activities of the people that they choose to shout down as a justification for their behavior. Now, in the case of the city of New York, the police chief, this occurred right around the height of some of the deaths that were a direct result of the stop and frisk behavior by the New York City police. And so activists in Providence have been very successful in fighting stop and frisk, which, of course, as a libertarian, I'm opposed to stop and frisk. In the case of Antifa, you've got folks pointing to a clear history of fascism taking root in other countries and growing into not only a credible threat, but a governing presence. So what's your take? I mean, it's a challenging issue to get around. I of course believe in free speech at all costs, even highly offensive free speech, as long as the proverbial no one shouts fire in the crowded theater. But what's your take?
Interesting. You mentioned that. I actually talk about that whenever I talk about this issue. Is that that fire in the crowded theater line comes from Schenck versus United States, which is about the theater of war. It's about men who were arrested and thrown in jail for opposing the draft in World War I. And so I think in all of this we have to ask, who is to decide if the theater is on fire? Who is to decide what ideas are off limits? And I don't think that I should be able to decide for you what ideas are okay for you to think about. And I don't think you should be able to decide that for me. And so if we can't identify who the censor is going to be, then we can't have censorship based on disagreement.
Right.
It's a dangerous concept, because it's all well and good to say that this speech is too dangerous, it's too far outside the mainstream, but that's only a safe position to take when you're in the mainstream. If you're in the minority, you need the protections of the Constitution. That's why we have a First Amendment. We don't need the First Amendment for ideas that we all agree with. We need it for minority views. We need it especially for views like these crazy alt-right people who are far outside the mainstream. Those are the people that need First Amendment protections. If we abandon the First Amendment because we disagree with the speaker, then we've abandoned the First Amendment. Right.
I'm curious as to, and I'm not sure how actively you guys were able to monitor the debate, particularly in North Carolina. But I'm curious, taking an issue that's as highly charged and at the same time as nuanced as free speech is, I'm wondering how that plays in a state legislature. I mean, forget about party labels for a second. For example, in Louisiana, you had bipartisan support. They passed a bill, and the governor goes out and vetoes it. So what, for example, are you aware of what the rationalization was for a governor to that's an assertive step, a proactive step to actively veto legislation that was passed bipartisanly? What was his or her underlying philosophy?
Well, I think now with the events in Charlottesville, there may be people who've sort of lost their backbone, and we're seeing some of that. But I think before that, I think in Louisiana, I don't know why the governor vetoed the bill, but our assumption is that the universities had been quietly opposing it, and the universities simply don't want the legislature looking over their shoulder. But that is the duty of the legislature, to protect constitutional rights when they are threatened by other levels of government. So the legislature has a duty here, both as a protector of constitutional rights and as a supervisor for state-run universities. And the universities push back on that. They've always pushed back on that. One of my first cases was suing the University of Colorado because they had ignored the state concealed carry law and banned concealed carry on campus when they were clearly not allowed to do that. And we were able to push back against them, but the dispute was really over university authority. They didn't really have any care for the Second Amendment rights that were at issue in that case. Their only concern was maintaining their authority. And that's what we see here too. They want to maintain their authority at all costs. And some of these administrators don't want to admit that they failed at this task of protecting free expression.
Mm-hmm.
We were just attacked by the ex-chancellor of UC Berkeley as being anti-speech because we want to have limits on shout-downs. I think being attacked by someone who oversaw the free speech fiasco that was the Milo Yiannopoulos riot and the Ann Coulter disinvitation, to be attacked by someone like that as anti-free speech, I think suggests a sense of guilt on their part, because the evidence is clear that they've simply failed to protect free expression on campus. And some campuses are doing a fine job, and they should have nothing to worry about with this model legislation, because it just reinforces First Amendment protections and asks them to take First Amendment protections seriously. Mm-hmm. If they're already doing that, then we're all on the same page.
Right.
If they're not, then the model bill will give them a kick in the pants.
And given that universities are on the leading edge of both government-funded and privately funded research, and when I talk about research, I'm not just talking, say, biomedical, but I'm talking about political, any one of a number of things that academics do research in. I would imagine that the superficial concerns you have about control would be vastly outweighed by the concerns that speech codes and behavioral codes have on the ability for you to perform research of any one of these issues. I'm always astonished when that disconnect takes place, because the heart and soul of any university, the reason why they are in fact a university as opposed to a college, is the level of quote unquote research that takes place in any one of a number of areas. That's how it strikes at the heart of the education system. Now, your model legislation, I guess a couple of questions. First of all, explain to the listeners, if you will, is this dedicated solely towards state-sponsored universities, or is this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Because we believe that private institutions should be able to order their affairs however they see fit.
Okay.
But state institutions are governed by the Constitution, just like any other state government.
Okay. And a state comes to you and they're willing to, at least, and you and I have had conversations about these type of issues. A state comes to you, a legislator is involved, and they're willing to research this and sponsor this. What type of role will Goldwater take in terms of advising, helping steward, or do you simply provide them with the legislation, or are you willing to work alongside of them?
Well, we want to make sure that the legislation that's passed is good and that everyone understands what it does and understands why it's important. So we work really hard to make sure that when legislation is proposed that's based on our models, we work really hard to make sure that a good bill gets passed.
Right.
And whether that means public education or educating the members of the legislature, we're on the ground trying to make that happen. And we've done that with Right to Try very successfully. Our initiative to allow terminally ill patients to access drugs that have gone through phase 1 of FDA testing. Mm-hmm. We passed that law in 37 states. So we've got our ground game figured out.
Which, by the way, is why the coalition has such a profound level of admiration for the work that you folks do. Is there a challenge in addressing? You and I had one or two offline conversations where we talk about the differences between state constitutions. Clearly, all state constitutions are not created equally, and clearly, whether it be voter initiative issues, the methodology by which laws are adopted, there are so many variations on the theme. How difficult was it to come up with this type of, it almost sounds modular in effect, modular legislation? And are there challenges that you've run into at different state levels where the folks have to sort of customize what's going on?
Sure, the model bill is a model, and so it's adapted to each state. And And, given the political climate of each state, certain things get left on the cutting room floor.
Mm-hmm.
Given the structure of the government in a state, we might have to change the way the law works a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the model is a starting point, and even in the model itself is designed to be sort of collaborative with the university administration. It sets certain requirements for the university to follow in setting their speech policies. Content and viewpoint neutrality being very important.
Mm-hmm.
But it gives the university some latitude to create a speech policy that fits its needs, so long as it meets these minimum requirements.
From the time that North Carolina, or at least some portion of the North Carolina legislature embraced this project, to the time it actually became law, did it manage to go through in one session? Was there a great deal of discussion ahead of time, if you will, collaboration between the university system there and folks on the ground and in the legislature? Describe, if you will, in a couple minutes that we've got left, describe for me, if you will, how it actually happened. How did the sausage get made?
Well, I never like to look too closely at that process, but
Yeah.
It's a long process. It's a process of talking to people before the bill is even drafted to get them, tuned into this issue so that they understand why it's important and what needs to be done to solve it. And then from there, making sure that the bill doesn't get torn apart in the amendment process.
Right.
And so it's always sort of a little bit miraculous when the bill comes out the other end and you still recognize it.
No one's passed any user fees attached to it. No one's attached any licenses or exams or any permitting process. Yikes. With your perspective on all the different areas you cover, and given the ferocity of the past week, now Virginia, for example. Now I'm thinking out loud here. The University of Virginia is a state school, isn't it?
Yeah.
In fact, it's widely regarded as one of the 2 or 3 finest state universities in the nation. Are you aware of, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but what in Virginia, were there these type of free speech zones and things set up at UVA?
We actually have, one of the delegates passed a resolution last session in favor of our model bill, and we intend to run the model bill in Virginia. So there are
Wow.
Problems with the speech codes at the colleges in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly what UVA's shortcomings are, but we do intend to run the model bill in Virginia and try to put the state on an even keel.
Wow, I can imagine the type of, but it's this type of legislation. This accomplishes, I believe, a number of things. I'd be interested in your comments on it. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. And folks, Jim Manley from the Goldwater Institute, he is the senior attorney there. We're talking about legislation essentially, and it's kind of unfortunate it has to come to this where we have to pass a law to force free speech, but not only does this law have the practical impact of essentially forcing free speech to be able to occur, or at least I should say creating an environment where it is allowed to occur. But I would imagine, and particularly in light of the last few months' events, this has got to be cathartic in its own nature, because folks are going to have conversations with it about free speech as a result of this legislation that, quite frankly, wouldn't happen in its absence, would it?
No, it really puts a fine point on this whole situation, and history repeats itself. One of the examples that I use when I'm talking about this issue is the Yale Debate Club in 1963 invited George Wallace to speak, and when the university encouraged them to cancel the event because he was a segregationist and his views were abhorrent, and they did. They canceled the event, and the outcry came from free speech advocates,
Mm-hmm.
including the first woman to earn an advanced law degree from Yale, the first black woman. And the consensus was that by canceling this segregationist speech, that it was a blow to civil rights and civil liberties, because no one was able to engage on the issue. No one was able to attack these terrible views. And so now, in this sort of heated environment, is the time when we need to resort to speech, to dialogue, to debate. Because if we don't, then folks are going to resort to violence.
Right.
And if we can continue talking to each other, then the right ideas can win out, and the bad ideas can be exposed for what they are.
Right.
Otherwise, we just ignore bad ideas, and they fester, and they stay underground until they bubble up,
Right.
Like they have this weekend. So I say, take this opportunity, confront these bad ideas, have a discussion, and that's what we're trying to accomplish by passing this legislation, to create the environment to have that discussion.
Well, it's simply outstanding. Folks, you'll have an opportunity to, if you're not listening now, listen to this conversation, as well as read the Goldwater Institute's piece on this at coalitionradio.us. Jim, I want to extend a personal thanks to you and the organization. We've had folks on from your organization now 3 or 4 times in the last 4 or 5 weeks, covering a range of issues. Just great conversation, strong philosophy, strong ideas, in a nation that clearly desperately needs them. So again, my hat's off to you and your organization.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure talking with you. I wish I had more time to do more tonight. We'll have to pick this up again some other time.
That and anyone, I mean, truly, folks, Jim Manley, truly a Renaissance man when it comes to civil liberties. There's probably another half a dozen issues. I look forward to the emails that I get from you folks, because they're simply outstanding. Folks, Jim Manley from the Goldwater Institute joining us here on the Coalition, talking about free speech. In the wake of the past 6 months, of all the serious issues we've discussed tonight in terms of civil liberties, this gets right to the core of it. Thank you so very, very much for joining us tonight.